Okay, so for week 3, you had 2 questions, and they're very similar questions. I'm going to start basically with both of them, to be fair. There are 2 concepts here, but they're very interreactive. So here are the questions, as you know from what you did. With your particular exercise, you were supposed to answer one of them and then respond in your peer comments to the other one. So depending on how you did that, will also determine the point values on your peer comments. But the first one obviously has to do with how the different colonizers colonized the Western Hemisphere. And the second one has to do, to a certain extent, with the Columbian exchange, but also with indigenous societies and European societies and how they interacted and how that affects us still to this day. All right, so here are your 2 questions and your 2 big points. Okay, so where are the people in 1500? Paris has 20,000 people. London has 50,000 people. These are a lot of people. The British Isles in its entirety has approximately 3 million people. France has 16 million of people, a lot of people. But before European contact, North America has probably 15 million, about the same size as France. Central America, which was the most densely settled area in the Western Hemisphere, had between 90 and 112 million people, which was approximately 1/5 of the world's populations. So it was not insignificant at all. And here's kind of the layout in North America of where peoples were. I would point out that what you're looking at are, particularly in the U.S. or in the North American Southeast, where you see the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Creek, Choctaw, etc. A lot of these peoples are peoples that are there after what is referred to as the decimation of the disease or the shatter zone. The societies that lived there prior to European arrival, and by that I mean principally the Spanish, were in many ways different from the ones that were there in approximately 1600 because they were literally destroyed by the disease. And with upwards, well, somewhere between 50 to 90% of their populations decimated, depending on what numbers you accept, they had to create new societies. We refer to this as a process of creolization, the making of new societies out of pre-existing societies. And I'd like to point out that these new societies were societies made out of desperation. These peoples had nowhere else to go, so they had to come together to survive in whatever small groups they could, and they had to adapt their customs and their belief systems to the people that they were coming in contact with. So these are whole new societies. They are made up of ideas from the old societies that no longer exist, but they're still new because they've had to literally create new constructs and new ideas. And this is going to be, I'm pointing to the Southeast because we know this. There is a really good book about what is referred to as the Mississippi shatter zone. And it means the Mississippi cultures, not Mississippi itself, but this whole area in the Southeast. But this happens throughout the Western Hemisphere, not just the North, but also Central and South America, as the indigenous peoples are forced to learn new ways and to adapt to the fact that so much of their population is being destroyed. All right, so where we are with these questions, we're in the 1600s, and here are effectively what we're looking at. Your main colonizers are, of course, the Spanish, who are the green, the Portuguese, who are the tan, I'll call them tan, and then the French, who move in to that blue area, but they don't control that blue area like the Spanish, the Portuguese, or anybody else does. They don't colonize with the same number of people coming over to take control. Theirs is a different thing, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But for the most part, while they claim control of that area, they're not everywhere in that area. Then you get the British, which are the red. You get the Dutch, who are the purple. And what you don't see is that effectively right here, for a little while, the Dutch are here as well. And we'll talk about that in a minute. And then, of course, your colonized peoples are your Native Americans and your Africans who are being imported in big amounts. So, the conquistadors. Independent adventurers commissioned by the Spanish crown to subdue new lands. And these are the guys who start arriving soon after Columbus is here. This is who Cortez is, Hernando Soto, Vasco da Gama. There are a lot of these guys who basically just come in, and their big thing is that they want to conquer the lands, get the gold and silver for the crown. By 1512, they've decimated the major Caribbean islands. Much of that is due to disease. By 1521, Cortez has destroyed the Aztec Empire. Again, much of that because of disease. 1539 to 42, De Soto explores the southeast. And as I've mentioned before, what ultimately happens with this is that while he and his small band of merry adventurers go from Native American village or town to the next one, they're spreading disease. They're out there dealing with these people, taking their stuff, trying to make friends with them, making records of where they are. Their pigs that have escaped them are proceeded in front of them. And this is part of what I was saying, that 100 years after this, the British start showing up, and they have these maps that De Soto's explorers brought back to Europe with them. De Soto himself dies on the Mississippi somewhere around 1541. But the rest of his group comes back, and they bring these maps with them. So when the British start coming in the mid to late 1600s, they bring these maps with them thinking, okay, this is where we're going to find these villages. They don't find villages. They find skeletons and grown over areas where obviously once there were houses or huts or communities or whatever. And this is because the disease has killed so many of them. So this is, again, as part of where we get this whole construction of creolization, the making of the new communities. All right. Coronado explores the Southwest, 1540 to 1542. And then we get, these wonderful images. There's Cortez, da Gama, etc. Right. All right. So here's European explorer in the Americas, 1500 to 1550. Again, substantial parts of it, all of that yellow is, of course, Spain. The purple is the French, and they come in initially. In fact, for a while, the French and the Spanish compete. St. Augustine is actually the oldest city in the Western Hemisphere. It was originally settled by the French, and the Spanish came in and basically, it was Fort Caroline under the French. The Spanish come in and consider them to be heretics because they are Huguenot, which are Protestant. So they kill them all off and reclaim it for Spain and rename it St. Augustine. And it becomes a pivotal point in the explorations of the what becomes the U.S. Southeast. And again, the English initially with Cabot in 1947, they're just hitting the far north, etc. So these are all really good renditions of where people go and what they're exploring. Some of you mentioned to me gold, guns, and glory, because these are the three G's, as the Spanish called them. The three big things that the Spanish conquistadors were looking for. Gold, guns, and glory. And gold, of course, comes from taking the gold from the Aztecs and the Incas, and then from the mines. God is, of course, conversion of the indigenous peoples, and glory is anything that has to do with helping them with that. It's supposed to make them wealthy, personal wealth coming from control of land, and then later the encomienda system. So I'm not going to go in a great extent through this. It's a really good visual, and I really love this rendering of Tenochtitlan. The city that the Aztecs, or the Nahua, literally built on the water. It's really fascinating, but then, of course, it becomes destroyed. All right, and then effectively looking at Central and South America, but this, of course, Tenochtitlan, all of this is the Aztec area right here, then this is Mayan, and then as you go further down, you're getting into eventually where the Incas will be, but you're also looking at their trade routes and the things that they're looking at and what they're conquering. So, De Soto in North America, a lot of this goes back to the Pueblo, the conquering of the Pueblo. Well, no, I'm sorry, not De Soto. De Soto's the American Southeast and the mound builders and all that. Then you get to Da Gama, who is in the Pueblos. All right, so the encomienda system was the original system by which the crown, the Spanish crown, basically gave control of plots of land to conquistadors and to other Spanish bureaucrats. And the whole idea behind it was that their obligation was to convert the indigenous peoples to Christianity, but at the same time to force those peoples to produce food, to do agriculture on the land, and not to let them leave. It is part of why the Pueblos ultimately revolt, because it's a really horrific system. It's a form of slavery. The distinction being that ultimately they couldn't sell them, but they could certainly punish them, and they did quite a substantial amount of that. There you go. Okay, and this is basically what an encomienda system looked like. You had lots of indigenous people working. You had a central area that contained a church. You might have had an Aztec temple close by, but if they went there, they had to go only for Catholic masses that were done in it. So that's kind of like a heretical thing for them. So yeah, it was a really horrific system. All right, so the encomienda system rewards conquistadors and later bureaucrats themselves. Appointed officials answered only to the crown, which means they don't answer to the church. And strangely enough, as horrific as the church is about trying to enforce Christianity on these people, it was also much more tolerant. In fact, at points, the papacy actually interjected and told the Spanish crown that they had to get their conquistadors under control because they were brutalizing people. This is part of the Catholic Church protecting Indian rights, but also performing mass conversions to try to get them there. And a big part of that was because it was the pushback against the Reformation. And a bigger point here is by 1650, 500,000 Spaniards in the New World were unmarried males who intermarried with indigenous peoples. And this creates a very large mixed blood population that includes, it creates the casta system, which is the system by which people are defined by who their parents are. If your parents were both Africans, then you were effectively African. If your parents were Indian, then you were Native American, both of which are on the lower rungs. If your parents were mixed, Native American and African, then you were a mestizo, if I remember correctly. And then it goes up the line, and it goes through all kinds of variations. The casta system was very elaborate and very ornate. And the people who were at the highest point of that were normally the people who were half Spanish and half Native American. These would become the Creoles, the people who had the lighter skin tones and whose fathers, who were normally the ones who were Spanish, were willing to provide for them, which is part of what creates this new status of a pseudo middle class, pseudo professional group in Spanish America, but it's a group that is not allowed to go back to Spain. This is a group who's considered to be the rising middle class. They're going to be given positions by their fathers in the Spanish bureaucracy. They're going to be given, if they decide to go to school, they're going to become professionals who will be remaining in Central and South America. They're not going back to Spain because in Spain, their fathers are still married to actual Spanish women and they have children. They have legitimate children there who have titles and have all of those things. All right, expanding into the borderlands. And what we mean by borderlands is the area that is not Spanish, because the Spanish haven't managed to get total control of it, but maybe not necessarily, maybe belonging to another empire, perhaps France, perhaps England, and perhaps still just native, as in it hasn't been totally and completely colonized or controlled. So the land and wealth in the areas that the Spanish consider their borderlands are effectively Mexico, particularly northern Mexico, Florida or La Florida, Arizona, California, New Mexico, and Texas. And these will be areas that are contested. 1565 sees the first Spanish settlement in Florida. That's when the Spanish take control of St. Augustine from the French. 1609, they begin to settle in what we recognize as New Mexico. And then 1659, what we recognize today as El Paso, Texas. The 1700s in Louisiana, but by that point in time, they're taking control from the French. So, all right, and speaking of the French, this would be the second group. So if you're looking at how the Spanish treated Native Americans and how they colonized, and obviously you have the encomienda system and later the repartimente system. For the French, as I mentioned before, the French have control of a big group or a big territory, but they don't settle the same way everybody else does. In 1608, Samuel de Champlain founded Quebec, and that becomes a center hub for trade more than anything else. The French Empire basically runs down the St. Lawrence River, the Great Lakes, and then later the Mississippi River, because effectively what they're doing is using the rivers to transport goods. And most of those goods are, of course, furs. That was the basis of their economy. They needed the Native Americans because the Native Americans knew how to hunt. As I've mentioned before, they were basically like the Portuguese around Africa. They were a trading post empire. They established a lot of trading posts. They encouraged the natives to come. They paid them for their pelts in either technology, such as guns and metal things, or in food supplies or in other things that the Native Americans needed. The other thing is that the French established what are called the coureurs de bois, or the runners of the woods, who were also French hunters who went out to hunt the same pelts, beaver, deer, fox, etc. And these guys, recognizing very quickly that the Native Americans knew the best places to hunt, often settled in Native American communities, intermarried with Native Americans, had their own children. This is another form of mestizo, the French and Native American ones, and often remained the rest of their lives in these Native American communities. And in fact, towards the end of the 1600s into the 1700s, the French government tries to find ways to bring them back because they're really concerned about the fact that they're losing so many of their indigenous French hunters into these Native American communities. And what they want to do is to actually try to compete with the Spanish to convert more Native Americans. So they start basically demanding that the coureurs de bois bring their wives and families into these trading posts and establish houses, send the kids to school, do all these kind of things. And what they find is that the Native American wives don't tolerate it very well. They come, they try, they don't like it, and they leave. And when they leave, the coureurs de bois also tend to leave. There are a number of missionary activities to convert the Indians to Christianity. With the French, unlike the Spanish, the French actually send missionaries into the wild, out into Native American communities to try to convert them. They don't force them like the Spanish do to live in systems of indentured servitude or of servitude where they convert them. So this is another one of the big differences between the way the Spanish and the French attempt to convert people. Unlike Spain, up until about the early 1700s, the French crown made little effort to actually settle down. So the big thing was the quest for furs and converts. The growing trade in beaver pelts and fish stimulated the founding of the colony of New France in North America. Champlain established the first permanent settlement in Quebec. The fur trade created that partnership between the natives and the French, and missionary activities to convert the Indians to Christianity was a major colonial motivation. There's some really good documents that have been translated to English called the Relations, and I think they're the Jesuit Relations. I could be wrong. It could be the Dominican Relations. But anyway, it is a group of literally journals that were kept by French missionaries when they encounter different peoples, and they've been compiled together, and you can find them online. They're really, really cool for finding out what's going on. All right, so the Dutch, their quest is for wealth. Unlike pretty much everybody else coming out of Europe, the Dutch were already more religiously tolerant. In fact, they were the most religiously tolerant people in Europe. The Puritans who came to Plymouth literally were living in the Netherlands before they bought passage or contracted to work for the London Company of Virginia, or the Virginia Company of London. It's one or the other. The people who settled Jamestown, they contracted with them because they were more afraid that their kids, who were being able to practice their Puritan religion in the Netherlands, were unfortunately becoming too Dutch. They were learning how to speak Dutch. They were wearing Dutch clothes. They had Dutch clogs. They were losing what these people considered to be their English identity. So they wanted to move out of the Netherlands, not because of a lack of tolerance, but because of a lack of Englishness, which I find very amusing in the long run. But yes, that's a big part of what motivated the Puritans who settled Plymouth to come here. The Dutch already had capitalism and stock exchanges, which we've talked about before. They had the first Wall Street. Slavery was already a part of their economy. The Dutch were among the first major slave traders. In fact, they will begin to compete with the Portuguese to get complete control around Africa. And they are among the first to bring slaves with them to North America. They established New Netherlands colony on Manhattan Island. Henry Hudson, whom they hired to quest for them, was an English guy, but he was literally looking for a passage through the Western Hemisphere to get to Asia. So this is what was called the Northwest Passage, which didn't exist, but that was figuratively what he was looking for. They did, however, unlike everybody else, and perhaps because of their variable views on religion, they did believe that the Dutch and the natives, well, actually the natives and everybody else, were pretty much equal. So they believed that they couldn't just take Manhattan Island from the natives. They had to buy it. They had to make an equal exchange. The problem was that it is probable that there are two different interpretations of what was happening. One of them was that the people they actually gave the money to buy it weren't actually the people living on Manhattan at the time. I'm not going to try to butcher the name by pronouncing it, but that's one possible reason why things went to the bad. The other possible reason was because, and this is actually more likely no matter who they were dealing with, the natives didn't understand the concept of long-term ownership, whereas the Dutch did. The natives probably assumed that they were being paid for a temporary use of the land, whereas the Dutch thought it was going to be like long-term ownership, and that this is part of where things literally went to the bad with it. But because the Dutch believed that the indigenous peoples were effectively equal to them, everywhere they went, they carried wampum because they appreciated and understood that that was the mechanism of exchange with the natives. They did especially prize beaver pelts, and in that respect, they were competing with the French in terms of getting furs out of the Western Hemisphere. They also, though, imported people to build farms and lumber camps, and it was because of this, in much the same way that we will talk about shortly with the Puritans in Plymouth and Boston and so forth, that they come into conflict with the Native Americans, because the more of them that came in and took over control of land, the less the Native Americans liked that. They did not have any success bringing indentured servants over. They tried really hard to encourage people to come, but no one wanted to come. And thus they were forced to bring in slaves. So that by 1660, New Amsterdam had more enslaved peoples than anywhere else. Ultimately, by 1664, they would surrender New Amsterdam to the English because of a series of wars fought between the Dutch and the English, effectively over control of shipping lanes more than anything. And basically what happens is that in exchange for giving up New Amsterdam, the Dutch take control of Suriname, which was one of their provinces in South America, which the English allow them to have literally into the 1800s. All right. And then we get the English. They were the slowest European power to begin New World expansion. It's only under Elizabeth I that this happens. Even though John Cabot does give them claims to areas, they don't actually start looking into them because Elizabeth was far more concerned about trying to harry or annoy the Spanish. Because, though, the English government and the English economy is expanding through the 1500s, this is what we refer to as the Elizabethan Golden Age, rising production of wool cloth gets merchants looking for new places to sell them. And they're looking initially to sell them to the colonies that already exist in the Western Hemisphere, but then eventually discover that they probably need to settle their own. There you go. Population growth, rising prices, depressed economic conditions of ordinary people, and made them willing to immigrate in search of opportunity. That coupled with certain levels of religious freedom, which to a certain extent we've already been reading about. So the Protestant Reformation, particularly in England, plays a big role, and it starts in the 1570s when Henry VIII, in hopes of getting a divorce from his first wife, basically separates the English church from the Catholic Church, saying that no, I will now be head of my own church, and in this church I'll be able to divorce her. The thing is with Henry, and this is part of the big problem from this point out, is that Henry only wants his divorce, and he wants the money coming from the taxation or the tithing that the church does, because he resents Catholic property being owned by the church in England. So he demands, he does. He demands of his Parliament and of his people, that they allow him to run the church. This is where we get the creation of the Anglican Church. He doesn't make any serious changes to the religion itself, to the orthodoxy, to the doctrine. All he wants is to be sure that the money comes to him and that he can do certain things like get his divorce. This is not out of keeping. 1517, Martin Luther had nailed his 95 Theses to the church door at Wittenberg, Germany. 1536, John Calvin published his Institutes in Geneva, both of which argued that there were different ways to interpret the Bible. The interesting thing, of course, is that Henry VIII is not looking for different ways to interpret the Bible. He's looking for different ways to do what he wants to do. In the big picture, though, the Reformation pitted European Protestants against Catholics, and that's a big part of what goes on with the founding of the Western Hemisphere. As I mentioned before, the French were actually the first ones in St. Augustine, or Fort Caroline, as they called it. But the Spanish defeated them in a battle, considering them to be heretics because they were Huguenot, which is the French version of Protestant. They killed them all and basically took St. Augustine over. The same thing is going to continue from this point out. It's a big point of why the Spanish are trying desperately to convert the indigenous people. It's why the French attempt to convert the indigenous people, because they are looking to bring more Catholics back into the Catholic Church. All right, so in Protestant England, you get the Protestant movement. Again, I'm not going to go through all of this. We get Calvinist Christianity expanding into Northern Europe. Calvin stressed God's omnipotence. There you go. Yeah, John Calvin, very interesting. And they believed in predestination, the idea that when you were born, God had already determined whether you were going to heaven. This becomes one of the big problems for Calvinists because it begins to, after 4 or 5 generations, people begin to go, okay, so why am I working so hard to live this way if I don't even know if I'm going to heaven? In France, the Calvinists were referred to as the Huguenots, and they are going to do their own variation of a civil war in France. Again, these are the guys who settled Fort Caroline. Scotland has the Presbyterians. John Knox will be a big leader in that group, and he will actually come to England with James I. And then in England, you get the Puritans, who were literally the guys who are appreciative that they are Protestant, but they want to purify the Anglican Church because they don't like all the Catholic stuff in it. We also refer to them as separatists because they wanted to separate the Anglican Church from the Catholic rituals. It is not a coincidence that at about the same time, Elizabeth I becomes the first female ruler of England, and that's basically because Henry VIII's only son dies when he's still a teenager. And in lieu of allowing a Catholic to take control, Parliament accepts Elizabeth because they want a Protestant. It's like, we've already been through this, we're done with it, whatever. All right, so Elizabeth does, like her father, Henry VIII, she retains the Catholic ritual to appease those who are foundationally Catholic, but it's still the Anglican Church. And ultimately, even though she's a very strong ruler, at her death, because she dies without an heir, she has to bring in James VI of Scotland, who then becomes James I of England, and has to basically make negotiations with him so that he will continue to run England as a Protestant country. There you go. Whenever there was war, England aligned with Protestant nations against Catholic powers, basically because religion also became tied up very much in politics. There you go. The Pope excommunicated Elizabeth in 1571. There were many anti-Protestant Spanish actions, including the attempt by Philip II to reconquer the Netherlands, many of whom actually become Protestant in order to fight against him. Not because they believed in it, because this, again, becomes a political alignment as well. In 1572, he was one of the investors in what becomes known as the St. Bartholomew Day Massacre in France, where they arranged to have the leaders of the Huguenot faction in Paris for a wedding that they have conspired with because they didn't think the wedding would come off. In that wedding, the wedding was supposed to be between the Protestant royal heir and the Catholic princess, Margot. And it was supposed to be a great, literally a massacre of all the Protestants, but Henry escapes with Margot into the countryside, where they managed to live for several years without being conquered. And in that time period, France goes through a particularly brutal civil war about this, which leads to Henry agreeing finally to take the throne of France, to convert to Catholicism, to take the throne, as long as there are specific areas of France that are carved out for Protestant worship. And this agreement that gives him the throne is referred to as the Edict of Nantes, Nantes. And it stays in place for almost 100 years until Louis XIV declares that it's invalid because there are no more Protestants in France. And that's because he spends much of his reign driving them out. All right, so the English, again, very anti-Spanish. A lot of that is about religion, but an even larger amount of that is about trying to steal all the Spanish plunder coming out of the Western Hemisphere. Elizabeth supports the Dutch in their resistance against Spain. She sends 6,000 troops into the Netherlands, and then she consigns Sir Francis Drake, one of her favorite nobles. She gives him what's called a letter of marque, which is a covert permission slip to effectively commit piracy. And a big part of that was with him trying to capture Spanish ships bearing gold and silver from the Western Hemisphere, which he does really well. If you want some really fun stuff, read a lot about Sir Francis Drake. He is one of the most interesting people probably in all of history. The Spanish become so incensed with Elizabeth and with her attempts to thwart them that they basically plan an attack on England. At this particular point in time, it is called, they send a great fleet called the Spanish Armada, which at that point in time was supposed to be the major navy in the world, against the English, and Elizabeth and her people defeat them. This is the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, which basically makes England the ruler of the seas. So a big part of what happens after that is the English start going, well, hey, okay, these guys have been making money in the Western Hemisphere, then we need to be getting in on that as well. Many English people leave England. Part of that is because after 1603, after Elizabeth dies and she is succeeded by James VI of Scotland, who becomes James I of England, they don't trust this agreement made between Parliament and James as to the keeping of English Protestants. So a lot of people start to begin to move over after that. The other thing is that the economy in England is changing. The decline of the wool market becomes problematic, thus leading people to want to go find new ways to make money, and religious persecution. 1600, the only English settlement was the failed Roanoke settlement from 1588. But then, in the early 1600s, Richard Hakluyt, a Dutch guy, begins to disseminate pamphlets throughout England talking about the wonders of the Western Hemisphere and how people needed to go there to make money. So we get the beginning of English colonization with small settlements basically created by companies. And I think that's the big thing to bear in mind. It's companies that are going to drive settlement initially in England. This is what the colony of Virginia in Jamestown is about. It is what Bermuda is about. These are all colonies that the Queen gives her blessings for, but companies are financing them. And this becomes a very big deal. I'm not going to go through all the stuff with Roanoke, even though there are speculations now that what happened to the colonists that existed or that remained behind was that they ended up fleeing to the local Native Americans to live. Okay, so as the British and as the Spanish and the Portuguese and all these other peoples come, they're going to have an effect on native cultures. I mean, already native cultures have altered. That was the whole point with the whole thing about the shatter zones, is that they've already had to rebuild themselves once. And now In some areas, less than 100 years later. In other areas, up to 300 years later, they're having to do it again. Initially, as I've tried to point out in some of our discussion points, the natives didn't perceive of Europeans as a threat. They knew their world, and their world involved other natives. And so when they first started seeing Europeans, they were seeing them in really small groups, and they were seeing them as people who were bringing them things they could use, like, I don't know, weapons and metal pots and things like that. They don't clue in very quickly to the idea that these people are also bringing them disease. And in some instances, they get the disease before they see Europeans. So they really don't put the two things together. That's going to take a while, like 5, 6 generations, maybe 100 and some odd years. Even the Europeans don't put that together initially, which is part of why when we talk about this, it's hard to put culpability on the Europeans. They don't understand what disease is. They don't understand what they're doing. It's not going to start until around the late early 1800s that they've begun to put this thing together and start using it. That's when you can start calling them culpable. But until that point in time, they're as ignorant as the indigenous people are as to what's causing these diseases. And in fact, as a pointed note, one of the reasons why many indigenous people convert to various levels of Christianity is because of the belief that, the Spanish, the British, the French, they're all right. The gods of these people are stronger because the natives themselves are dying out from these horrific diseases and their gods aren't helping them. So in many respects, the diseases are things that are unknown, unexplained, and ultimately tied to the strength of gods. And that's not uncommon in any culture anywhere in the world in this period. What is more significant, though, is how European economic concepts alter indigenous cultures. One of the big ones to come along is trade. In the same way that we've talked about the Africans basically selling their own people because that was something they had been doing long before the Europeans arrived and they didn't see this as a big deal. The Native Americans do the same thing. For as long as there have been Native Americans and they've been at war with each other, one of their constituent components has been taking captives from other societies and bringing them into their own society, either as slaves initially, maybe later adopting them to take the place of people that were killed, etc. So to them, this is not anything new. But when the Europeans start doing it, they don't realize that what they're actually doing is not incorporating them or assimilating them. They're literally selling them away and making them as chattel slaves. I like this. Cruelty, kindness, greed, deception, trade, theft, surprise, sickness, captivity, enslavement. All of these things were factors that helped accelerate the changes of how Native Americans viewed the Europeans and the changes made to Native American societies by Europeans. Native Americans were eager initially for European trade. Eventually, they become dependent on it, which is problematic. But it also then begins to influence warfare patterns because Europeans want slaves, so it begins to make Native Americans fight amongst each other even more so that they can take more slaves and sell them. Disease itself, we've done all this. I'm not going to go through all of this again. But in the first 130 years of contact, about 95% of the people in the Americas died from disease. Again, that's variable depending. It can be anywhere from 50 to 95, etc. Disease killed as much as 90% of the people of coastal New England, and that is most probably true. These are images from that period. That was a primary source point of pictures of Native Americans dying from smallpox. So, Columbian exchange, most of you were good with that from both discussion 2 or from the second module and from this one. The ways in which I think that the Native Americans profoundly affected Europe and other parts of the world was because they gave them so many foods that they could now grow in other parts of the world and people could live longer, and that's going to give the Western Europeans particularly a big exchange or a big leg up. So conquest, exploration, explorers, conquistadors, missionaries, permanent settlers. Yeah, there you go. West Africa, Many sub-Saharan cultures. Islam was very strong, particularly along the coast and in North Africa, but also in parts of sub-Saharan Africa. Again, along the eastern coast where the Swahili city-states had been established. They're very strong traditional beliefs, much like the Native Americans had. The big empires at the point in time that Europeans began to arrive, Mali and Ghana and North Africa, but there are large trading centers that we know about now in sub-Saharan Africa. Elder-led clans basically dominated through much of Africa, particularly in Central and South Africa. There you go. And thus the beginning of the slave trade. Again, we've been through a lot of this. Most African societies saw criminals or prisoners of war as slaves, and they did try to make war quite often to take territory, to gain agricultural control, and to have prisoners that could then produce food. From the 10th to the 15th century, 5,000 Western Africans were sold as sugar workers in Egypt, as domestic servants and craftspeople throughout the Arabic world, and as soldiers in North Africa. So this is the African slave trade prior to European involvement. But then, as trade began to take off in the Mediterranean, particularly between the Ottomans and the Venetians and Genoese, there's more of a demand for slaves. Then the Portuguese enter the market and basically take up where the Arabs and the Moors have left off because they've established this trading post empire around Africa. The Portuguese were a new trading partner. They were willing to sell guns, horses, copper, brass, and textiles to Africans who could produce slaves and ivory and other things. There you go. Long been a part of African life. So it wasn't new to Africans, but the extent to which it becomes endemic is new to Africans and the way they're treated. The problem is, by the time many African societies realized what was happening and wanted to get out of it, they didn't have a choice. The Portuguese basically held, literally, a gun to their head and said, well, if you don't provide us with slaves, we will take you as slaves. This is what happens with Congo, particularly. So, all right. So in the 14th century, the Atlantic Ocean emerged the stage for literally one of the biggest cross-cultural encounters in American history, or in human history, and this is what we refer to as globalization. It is the movement of people, particularly slaves, indentured servants, religious refugees, and adventurers from Eurasia and the Western Hemisphere, literally to, or from Western Europe to the Western Hemisphere. So, yeah, this is very sad. There you go. By 1831, more Africans than Europeans came to the Americas. All right. So if you were looking at those questions, basically everything in this PowerPoint, everything in this information is usable for either of those questions. And if you had followed the instructions, then you know that regardless of which one you chose to answer, you had to do peer comments on the other question. So all of this is effective. There's nothing here that you could not have used in either your top post and certainly in your two peer comments. And if you answered a question from me as a peer comment response, then that also was something that could have been used for either one of these. So the big thing that I'm seeing in terms of the discussions, for those of you who are asking me, is that while you might do a really good top post, peer comments tend to be lacking. A lot of you still can't get the idea that the peer comments are not supposed to be casual comments. They're supposed to be elaborations on the ideas. And particularly with this one, because it was guided peer comments where you had to address the other question, it has to be clear to me that you're addressing the other question. And a lot of you, it wasn't clear what you were talking about. So specifically, information is good. You must have citation in these peer comments, which means you must have factual information and knowledge that goes with them. If you are posting late to a peer comment or to a top post, if you're waiting until the last day to post, or even the next to the last day, I encourage you, go read what the others have posted. Because if you're posting something very similar to what they're posting, That's kind of a C-level work. The idea here is to be as thorough as you can with each part of the question. And if you're just kind of skimming through this and giving me something that you could have gotten from AI but put citation in, that's C-level work. If you're reading through the other top posts and they sound a lot like what you're writing, that's C-level work at best. The difference from that point becomes how you do the peer comments. And if your peer comments aren't substantive, then yeah, that C is going to fall to a D or an F. If you're doing C-level work and then you realize that there's a lot of stuff you can put in the peer comments, then that grade may come up to a B. But the big thing is, be thorough. Let me know that you actually understand what you're talking about and that this stuff is making sense to you. Be sure you cite. Be sure your citation is as close to correct as you can get it, which means understanding that Corbett and his colleagues wrote the textbook, not OpenStax. OpenStax is only where it lives. They didn't write it. So if you're using OpenStax, that's incorrect. And the best you're going to get, if you're citing thoroughly, is going to be a basic. If you're not citing thoroughly, it's going to be a below expectations because you're not citing thoroughly and you're using the wrong citation. So yeah, be sure you double check all that. Be as thorough as you can be. Be sure that when you read what you need for the responses, that you're doing what the responses require. Because when we have, and I'll just guarantee you this right now, when we have multiple questions, when you can choose between a question, it's always going to mean that your peer comments have to address the other question or questions. The whole idea being to get you into or to demonstrate to me an understanding of all of these ideas. So be sure you think about that. All right, so with that in mind, this is the kind of information I was looking for through the course of this, depending on which one you gave. There's lots of different information in here you could use. If you have specific questions about your grade for this discussion, review my comments. Go to the discussion itself and look specifically at the comments I made to you, because I personalize comments to each of you when I do these. I include the statements from the rubric, but at the bottom will be my personal comments to you. And then if you don't understand what I mean, or if you want more clarification, then ask me. Say, okay, you said this in your response to me, and I understand what this means, or I don't understand why what I wrote wasn't this. And I will be more forthright with you. But again, the other point is, look at what everybody else has written. If you're just basically handing me the same thing they're handing me, you're not really being in tune to what you're doing. So, all right, with that in mind, I will leave you now. If you have questions, let me know.